panel. Your next group read. I'm Liz French, Senior Editor at Library Journal, and I will be co-moderating round-robin style this book group discussion with my colleagues Melissa DeWild, Jill Cox-Cordova, and Sarah Hashimoto. I'm going to jump right in, but first I'll introduce you to the authors that we're talking to today in alpha order. We have Gina María Balibrera, whose book, The Volcano Daughters, is coming out from Pantheon. We have Taffy Brodesser-Akner, Long Island Compromise is her novel, coming out from Random House. Abby Daré is writing And So I Roar from Dutton. Phyllis R. Dixon, A Taste for More from Kensington. And last, Coco Mellors, Blue Sisters from Ballantine. Jumping right in, we're not going in alpha order now, we will be. I am going to ask Taffy about Long Island Compromise. It's about a wealthy Jewish family on Long Island, the Fletchers, and how they deal with, or don't, generational traumas, including the kidnapping of their father in the 80s, 40 years ago. But he's returned safely. Things are never the same, though, and it's bad. It's observational. It's hilarious in parts. I laughed a lot. And it's a rollicking good read. Taffy, my first question for you is, first an observation. My colleague, Sarah, not Sarah Hashimoto, described your 2018 profile of Gwyneth Paltrow as acerbic yet sympathetic. And I love that. I was like, yes, this book is that too. So was there any character that you wrote, there's so many characters, that you had a more of sympathy for, less acerbity and more sympathy? Wait. There you are.
First of all, thank you so much for having me and for saying such nice things. I, like for Gwyneth, I feel like I don't know where the acerbic comes. I don't disagree with it. I don't disagree with any observation that a reader has, but I do think that there is something in me that knows that at a magazine, I work for the reader. And I think that maybe that has carried over. But in terms of these characters, I have to say, I love them all. And at every point, as they're falling apart, I feel bad for them. I love them. And I think that the one, if I can pull one out, it's Ruth, the mother, who does not really have so much sympathy from her children. She gave up a lot of her life to take care of her husband. She put him first so that he wouldn't wreck the family. And ultimately, I think, like all mothers, I count my own mother and myself among them, does not get the credit she deserves.
She was my favorite too. So that's
I'm glad.
That you say that. I felt bad for her because basically she had no life except as like caretaker for
She
Carl.
made a real, devil's bargain, right? Yeah. Thank you. Great question.
Thanks. Now I'm turning it over to Melissa DeWild, who's going to talk to Phyllis Dixon about A Taste for More.
Hello. Hi, Phyllis. So Phyllis's new book is A Taste for More. It's a story of mothers and daughters against all odds success, generational trauma, and redefining home that spans the end of the Great Migration from the Jim Crow South of the 1950s to the promise of the 1970s. So my first question for you, like I said, the book takes place between the 1950s and 1970s, and you do such a great job of just weaving in all of that historical information into the story just seamlessly. You've really put people in those time periods. There's a lot going on there with the Great Migration. You mentioned freedom riders, redlining, the impact of freeways being built through neighborhoods. There are also cameos from famous musicians and authors. And so how did you go about researching this book? And was there anything that surprised you along the way during that research?
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. And I'd say the research that I did was research that I didn't even know I was doing because I grew up in that household. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but my parents were both had both come from the South, from Arkansas during the mid-century as part of that great migration. Of course, it didn't have a name then, or at least we didn't know it as a name. They were just coming, for better jobs and opportunity and all of that. So that was probably the initial research that, like I said, I didn't really know I was doing. And then also my background is actually in finance, I'd say as my day job. I spent 30 years as a national bank examiner for the U.S. Treasury Department. And so I've always had an interest in how finance and history intersect. And I worked on a project about banking and the racial wealth gap. And a lot of the racial wealth gap that we see today is the result of intentional policies like redlining, like the placement of interstate freeways, Jim Crow, and all of those type of things. So when I tell a story, I want to weave that into the story. It adds perspective to the situations that the characters find themselves in and kind of gives the reader a little more empathy for where they are. And now Margot, the character in the book, she leaves Mississippi to go north to make a better life for her daughter. So for her and her daughter. So that's the short description of the story. But if you know the socioeconomic background and political history of that time, you can understand a little bit better, why she did what she did and how the impact that it had on her. So I think one way I would describe it is that it's almost a fictionalized version of Warmth of Other Suns with a little bit of mother-daughter drama and murder.
A little bit of drama.
Yeah. And then as far as the musicians, I love all types of music. Actually, my last book, Intermission, was about a singing group. And I grew up during the Motown era and I live in Memphis. And so Memphis is a great place to be if you, especially for a person that likes music. So many of the music related references that are in A Taste for More, actually I had researched for a previous book. And then I just embellished them, kind of like Aretha Franklin loving her sweet potato pie.
Right. That was great when they so all these famous musicians come to this cafe where the main character works. That was a nice little scene there.
Yes.
I didn't mean to interrupt. Did you have more to add?
No.
Okay, good. Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Jill Cox-Cordova, and I'm talking to Abby today. I'm so excited, Abby, to have read your book. And So I Roar is coming out in August, published by Dutton. Generally, it's about choices, I would say, and a call for societal change. But specifically, it's about specific Nigerian rituals and customs that can produce harmful and tragic situations and outcomes for women. So my first question for you, Abby, is I read this book as a standalone, but I know that all your fans of the girl with the louding voice really wanted to know what Adeni did, what happened to her, how did things turn out for her, and boy, did you deliver with this book. I loved it. So my question is, what do you hope book clubs see and learn about Adeni this time?
Thank you so much. It's so exciting to be here. I think this is the first event I've got about the book, so very, very, very excited. I think we all know that Adeni never shuts up. So that's the thing that obviously carries on from the first book, is her inability to keep her feelings to herself. But beyond the resilience and the courage that we see, I think talking about what you said is having choices and having life I think we can all sort of relate to that, how life throw things your way totally unexpectedly, and you have to think really fast and make really quick decisions and tough decisions. And so we watch Adeni have to do this as still quite a young girl, but not just doing that alone. So she learns to navigate what sisterhood is like. So she has Tia with her on this journey as well. And as she goes back to her village to essentially face the consequences of a death that happened in the first book, she finds herself with other girls as well who have come from different backgrounds and have different stories. And she realizes that everyone has a story. There are also themes of grief as well, as Tia tries to navigate that in the story. So I think when book clubs are talking about the book, and he's discussing some of these themes, the courage and resilience that she faces, her ability to, the unity of voices, of sisterhood, of coming together and fighting and saying enough. I think there's so much power in when people come together and fight for justice. I think that was one of the biggest things I was trying to push in this, saying regardless of our backgrounds and our stories and where we've come from, there can be unity in us coming together to fight for something that we all believe in.
Well, I thought you did an excellent, that was
Thank you.
excellent, because I felt that I was part of this sisterhood as a reader. So I thought it was marvelous.
Thank you.
Gotta work the mute button there. Hi, I'm Sarah Hashimoto. I'm up next, and I am just delighted to spend some time with Gina María Balibrera, whose wonderful, absorbing debut, The Volcano Daughters, is coming out in August. I hope everybody places holds because it is fantastic. This novel tells the story of 6 young girls who lived during the time of the 1932 La Matanza massacre in Western El Salvador. There are 2 sisters, Graciela and Consuelo. They survive and they escape out into the world, each believing that the other has died. Their friends, all of whom were killed, stay with them even in death, and they watch over them, they lend their opinions, and they help them as they find their place in the world. This book touches on all kinds of topics: colonialism, racism, sisterhood, violence against women, mythology, folklore. It's so much to think about and talk about. It's a great book, and I'm really excited to be able to learn a little bit more today. So my first question is, in this book, you illuminate a place and a time. It's El Salvador in the 1930s, before and after La Matanza. This is a horrific act of genocide that was directed toward the country's indigenous population. This is something that doesn't often show up in literature. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how and why you were drawn to this topic and this place.
Thank you so much for having me today. And thank you for that excellent question, Sarah, and for your generous and lovely read of my book. I'm so happy to be here. So El Salvador in the 1930s, before and after La Matanza. So my family is from El Salvador, my father's family. And they arrived in San Francisco, where I grew up, in the 1940s. Basically, my father really came of age at a time of assimilation, and he was discouraged from speaking Spanish. There were all kinds of things I don't, really need to get into as much, but it was this place, and particularly the place that he left at the time that he left, and that my other family members left, was always, a point of curiosity and fascination for me. There's a Dutton poem, a Salvadoran poet, begins, "We were all born half dead in 1932. So this massacre, this matanza, it's really a part of the fabric of the kind of collective memory and the national identity of the country. And it's part of a very long project of this ugly tradition of mestizaje, which was to effectively, strip indigenous peoples of the West of their land, of their ability to grow their own food, and also, this project of whitening the skin of the nation. So many indigenous people in this massacre were killed as well, over 30,000, as well as many Afro-descendant people as well. And so it's really this massacre is a pretty ugly chapter in Salvadoran history, but it's part of part of a much longer book. This has been going on for a long time. There are casta paintings of people characterized by the color of their skin, different names and titles, and that is really all part of, I think, how this country was trying to sort of define itself as a nation at that time. So one of the kind of who I consider like a literary mentor, Roberto Lovato, wrote this wonderful book called Unforgetting, which is a nonfiction book based on his father's experience of La Matanza and what he witnessed in the country at that time. And there's this line that really guided me in it. Fascism depends on amnesia. And he had this sort of really interesting way of thinking about how a lot of these ideas that were evident, that were implemented by the dictator at the time of the massacre, really have continued on in Salvadoran history and Latin American history, and in our kind of global politics. And his writing this nonfiction book was an attempt to unforget, to write it down and remember. Notably, after the 1932 massacre, National Archives were destroyed. Census questions were changed, so people were, identifying themselves differently. They were not able to identify as Black or Indigenous, and their people were discouraged from speaking their languages, from dressing in their clothing, because there was this sort of artificial conflation of indigeneity and Blackness with communism. Anyway, so I was really, I think I was fascinated by this, horrified by this. I learned when I visited the country in 2005 that these archives had been destroyed, that the dictator who had authored this massacre had stayed in power for 12 years afterwards. And then I read the Popol Vuh, which is the Mesoamerican creation story. And there's this other refrain that really called to me. The word makes the world. And the idea that the world comes into creation by these forces of creativity. And to me, that also feels like sort of a creative corrective to this amnesia and this forgetting. And it's a corrective to this state-ordered erasure of these atrocities. Also in early 2000s, I visited the Museo de Palabra y Imagen. It's a beautiful museum that's in San Salvador. This is 2005. They were having the very first public exhibit of the Matanza. This was the first kind of public display of this massacre, because it hadn't been talked about, it hadn't been displayed. There were photographs, there were testimonies of survivors of the massacre. And so sort of like with all of this information, with my own family history, and with this sort of, all of these sort of troubling perspectives, I struggled with how to tell the story. I didn't want to sensationalize this. I wanted a story about sisterhood. I wanted a story that had some literary merit to it. I had kind of a knee-jerk aversion to what's often characterized as magical realism, because I wanted other threads in there too that I felt were maybe a little bit more subversive. So that's how I dove in. Sorry if I went on a bit long.
No, you can keep on going on. That was so great. Like what a complicated and powerful job that is to, delve into that and try to honor these historical events and the people who went through that, and still write a great book, like all of that combined. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Hello, Coco. I'm here to talk to Coco about Blue Sisters. It's a family story about the Blue Sisters. It also deals with family trauma and loss. The Blue Sisters grow up in a very violent, unstable household. their sister dies, they feel guilt, they feel grief, and a year later, they're still reverberating with this grief and guilt. And it's moving, it's touching. Sometimes you want to shake those sisters and say, stop doing this thing. But it's really immersive. You totally feel like the fifth Blue sister when you read it. And I liked reading it. So Coco, my question is, and I may be wrong, but I see some parallels between the Blue sisters. There's Avery, Bonnie, Nikki, and Lucky, and the March sisters of Little Women. The birth order, the sick one dies, and the remaining three struggle with guilt and grief. But they're the Blue sisters struggles ain't no March sisters. They have wild sex, they steal stuff, they maybe overcommit to boxing, they dip in and out of drug use. It's a big old mess, but it's delightful. So how did you go about character building, especially the sisters in this book? And did you consult any birth order books? Because there's a lot of them out there that say the oldest does this and the middle does that. Or did you just wing it and let it flow?
Thank you for that question. It's a big old mess, but it's delightful. Could sum up so much of my life, actually, flipping this book. I didn't consult any sort of birth order books because, a little bit like what Phyllis was saying about her research, I lived a lot of it in terms of I am the youngest of 4 siblings. My eldest 2 are half siblings, and I have a brother. So it's very different to the dynamic in the book. But I think I kind of intuitively understood how birth order sort of works from my own family. The tropes are the eldest sibling is very responsible and often a stand-in parent. Middle siblings are peacekeepers and diplomats, and youngest siblings are like rebels and the naughty ones that get away with everything. I am the youngest sibling, so I am familiar with that. It's actually funny because ever since I wrote this book, I keep getting served memes on Instagram about daughters. It's like, are you the eldest and a girl? You may be entitled to financial compensation. So apparently it's a universal thing that everyone can relate to. But I was sort of interested in what happens when you have this set role in a family and then you break it. So when you push against it, for me, that always creates something dynamic and kind of exciting. So exactly as you said, these sisters, Avery, who's the eldest, who's 10 years sober, hyper responsible, ends up having an affair and sort of quietly imploding her perfect life in London. And then Bonnie, the middle sister, who's a boxer, ends up her violence sort of takes over in a way she can't control. Lucky, the youngest sibling, who's a model in Paris, are sort of hard partying ways that for a long time went with the territory of being in her industry, begin to sort of spiral out of control and take on a sort of death-defying quality. And then Nikki, the sister who died, who wanted to be a mother, was trying to sort of avoid this surgery in order to have a child, ends up dying of complications with endometriosis and pain management. So I feel like everything I do is sort of, I take maybe familiar ideas and I just like to turn the dial up as far as it can possibly go to a place of sort of hyper realism. So these sisters in some ways are familiar, and I hope that readers can find a lot of themselves in them, but they're probably the most extreme version of every single type that exists. And for me, that's just the most fun. I like to have my characters do things that I would never allow myself to do. That's the sort of wonderful, giddy freedom of writing fiction.
Excellent. We're going to stay with you because I'm going to ask you, since you were the last, you get to be the first on the second question. And that is about Bonnie and the boxing champ and all the stuff, the world that you brought us into of boxing. And I never knew throw in the towel is from boxing. Just that little factoid was like, really? So how long have you been boxing? You do box, right? I read your acknowledgments and there you thanked some people in the gym. And did you ask any of your coaches or colleagues at the gym for input on getting everything about her boxing career right?
Yes, I started boxing in order to research for this book. I was already really interested in boxing my interest in boxing came from an interest in pro wrestling initially. I loved WWE, which I used to watch with my dad. And my like first imaginary friend was Chris Jericho, who is a pro wrestler, which is something I could unpack in therapy, like on my own, why that was going on. But and then I sort of became interested through Anthony Joshua and Katie Hill, who are two, a British and an Irish fighter that I love in boxing, that there's such a huge storytelling aspect. Like you get a lot of personal history about boxers, and there's this, you know, sort of really beautiful arc of where they came from and how they thrive. And I then became really interested in reading about boxing. So Joyce Carol Oates and Catherine Dunn are two amazing writers who write about the sport. And then obviously Hemingway and Norman Mailer, there are these sort of big, sort of heavyweight male writers who also write about heavyweights.
Heavyweight.
Exactly. And so I thought I hadn't seen a lot of writing about women boxers, to be honest. And I really was interested in writing about a character who is pushed to a kind of physical limit. And I feel like there's a lot of parallels between boxing and writing in terms of, you know, what the audience sees is the result of many hundreds of hours often of labor and craft that is not witnessed by anyone. And it's extremely solitary, and it can be deeply redundant, and it sort of pushes you beyond your human capacity. And so I wanted to write about that. And then in order to write about it, I felt I should train like a boxer. So for about 1.5 years when I was in LA, I lived in Venice. It was the first year of the pandemic. So I trained on the beach. I'm pretty obsessive, as I think a lot of novelists are. Like if I commit to something, like I'm going all in. So I like, you know, I had my little, my cup, I had my head guard, I had my like special mount gear. I was sparring, I got a black eye, which I was really proud of. And it was extremely fun and grueling. And I had not realized how incredibly tactical boxing is. Like it's chess on the body. You know, if you want to try to hit someone in the face, you have to trick them into getting their hands down. So it's about feinting. It's very psychological. It's about analyzing your opponent. I just loved it. I really did. And so I think my reader from my first book is not that interested in boxing. So I'm really excited to get some of these like 25-year-old bookstagram girls like really into the sport so we can all talk about it. But I'm glad you enjoyed that.
Thank you. Now we're kicking it back to Sarah to talk to Gina.
That is so cool. But I feel like it would be so scary to get into the ring like that and like fight somebody.
I think it sounds fun.
Now scarier than launching a debut novel. I think we will, if you can do a debut book, you can be a boxer.
So clearly your definition of fun is a little different than mine. But okay. All right. So Gina, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the language in your book. It is interwoven with untranslated Spanish words and phrases. You know, I have some high school Spanish. It didn't help me out too much. And, you know, part of me wanted to, you know, go look up the words and like, what is that word? And like, look on the dictionary and all that. And I didn't do that because I felt like I needed to like sink into the story and just let that wash over me and be part of it. And that was my approach. But I wonder, you know, did you have any thoughts or concerns about whether you should provide translations? Did you think maybe we should do footnotes, or maybe we should do a glossary, or maybe we should do nothing at all? And I wondered if you had any, what that thought process was as you were thinking about language in your book.
Thank you for that question, Sarah, and thank you for sharing some of your experience of it. I have a question for you. Did those words eventually kind of come to make sense for you, like as you read?
They really did. Now I don't know whether I was making it was the right, you know, sense of the word, and part of me too kind of wondered, you know, like is this like my high school Spanish, would it have helped me out at all? Because I felt like some of them were sort of colloquial things and, you know, expressions that you would say to your friends and your family and things like that, which might not be something that I would, you know, encounter. And also, I don't know if they're like different like dialects and things going on because they're different communities and cultures that are involved in that. So I think language can be very different across the board. But I was absolutely fine with it after about 3 pages. I was like, all right, we're just like in this and I just, it felt amazing. Now, I should also mention my main thing is audio. And so I'm really excited to see how this might turn out as an audio book. And that's something that you encounter in audio a lot, which is that feeling of like, okay, I have time to stop here. We're just like taking this ride together and just like letting yourself be carried along by it. So that was my approach. And I found it to be like, I don't know, I have my own understanding of it. I don't know if it's right, but it seemed to work. So that was good.
Thank you. Yeah, so absolutely. Some of the words that are in there, sprinkled in, are Salvadoran slang, cliché, and it's really specific to the culture. And so there are certain words that, can be found, I think, in other Spanish-speaking communities, like comadres. Comadres is this word that, literally means, to mother with, but you can, comadre is, someone you look up to in a way. So not even that literal translation of someone who would also mother your child along with you, but somebody who sort of mothers you as well, and somebody who has this sort of sense of community care. And so there are these some words that I think that are, it's cliche to say untranslatable, but they felt intrinsic to sort of the texture, the specific delight of certain moments, that are also really part of the fabric of the myth and the history of this place. So another one would be cadejos, and cadejos are those magic dogs that guard the volcanoes. That sometimes if you meet one that has red eyes, has black, it's a bad luck. If you have been drinking a lot, if you meet a different kind of dog, it means they're your protector, and they're going to protect you. So there are parts, some of these words do come from these really specific threads of myth that I wanted to be kind of woven into the story. This is they're part of the place. And, a lot of these words do refer to figures that I think circle around the characters in the story, and are both mythical and I think specific to the story, like Siwanaba. She's a woman who punishes men. And you find her by bodies of water, and she's really beautiful from afar, but when you come close to her, she has this really scary horse face. So I think there's, for me, it was, I wanted to sort of introduce these characters and also these pieces of slang with the same kind of gravity as I would the rest of the world, and sort of these more unfamiliar topics, because I think the country itself, El Salvador, is I think is misunderstood in many ways, or is less understood. And I think the specificity of the Salvadoran slang rather than the Spanish language slang that we might learn in a high school class, or that we might be more familiar with, which might be spoken in Mexico or might be spoken in Spain or somewhere else, I think was, that was less appealing to me, sort of to have those, words just sort of scattered in there. But the words that I did choose to keep and not translate are there because they are so specific to the characters and to the culture. And I speak as somebody who really had to learn a lot of these things. As I said, I grew up in San Francisco. I'm what's known as pocha, rotten. I don't speak perfect Spanish. And I really had to learn and investigate. And it was part of my research to really learn, that thing I've heard about. What does that myth actually look like when it's written down? What is that actually from? What does this word actually mean? I've heard my dad use this swear word. What is it? What's the root of it? What does it mean? And, there's something about lineage in one of the swear words. I guess I'll refrain from swearing on this library journal panel, but there are things about, you are the son of 6 million horse, right? like, what does that mean? And like the idea of lineage being so important, right, in this book and to these characters. And so there's a reason there's the hyperbole of that as well. And also the idea of motherhood that's in there too, those are things that I wanted to keep. Carcajadas are this cascade of cackling laughter. It means cackling, but it's also often referred to when we're talking about birds. There's a lot of birds in this book, birds traveling to the ceiba tree, birds that are always listening, and that comes from an idiomatic Salvadoran expression. There are parrots in the trees and they're always listening, meaning that someone's surveilling us. But then these are birds that can migrate, that can travel. And then carcajadas is I think very specific to a certain kind of laughter, the certain like pitch of laughter between sisters, laughter between good friends. And so there's a texture to that joy, there's a specificity to it, and I really wanted to keep that. So again, like as I said, I don't speak perfect Spanish. I didn't grow up in El Salvador, I've only visited. And I had to educate myself. I had to learn, and I learned from women I admire, the internet, my own travels and research. And I really wrote these words in for those who would, recognize those terms, and also those who would be curious about them, who would say, I'm going to let this wash over me, as you did, Sarah. Thank you. I'm going to let this wash over me, and try to kind of gather those context clues and figure it out, and then also dig into them as they would any other kind of part of this story.
I am so pleased to hear that description of the carcajadas, because that's exactly what I got from it. It is exactly it.
It's a joy cackle.
Yeah,
it's not like you can't control yourself. You're going to pee your pants.
I felt like that. Well, I think it's interesting though, in providing a translation, or if somebody seeks out their own translation, you have, like 3 words or a word or something like that. And then you feel like, well, that's the word. But what you're saying is it's so much more than that. So like for me to give you a translation makes you think that now you got it, but there's a lot more to say. And how can we capture that, so that's interesting. The other question about, I think, and I wish I had this question, we'll have to talk about it later, is this idea of people who, are returning to their culture or their history with pieces missing, and like this insecurity of being like of that culture, but not of that culture, an outsider, but still part of it. And, I think this is a trend that I have seen, in a lot of literary fiction going on these days, of people who are like wanting to speak for these, their ancestors, but feeling a little insecure about what role they can play in that. So that's an interesting question as well, but I should let other people go. Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess I'm up next.
It's you, Jill. Thank you both.
Well, that whole discussion reminded me of how, you all as writers, the word choice isn't the only thing that's important. It's how you present it. So Abby, I would like to talk to you about the structure of your book, because you didn't write it as straight prose. You've got letters, you've got more than one point of view. You've got at some of the bottom of the pages, words of wisdom that end up being like a small little book in itself. And you even have a talk show transcript, which I was so impressed by. So all of it made me, it enhanced my reading experience. But I wonder why this structure was so important to you.
Thank you for that question. I think that so the book, the first 90% of the book happens in sort of 12-ish hours. And this is me, Abby Daré. I have so much to say about harmful tradition, about the way women and girls are treated. And I wanted to bring in sort of the different facets of these women's lives and these girls' lives. So looking at the transcript, for instance, which I loved writing that, because we have 6 girls who are stuck in this little forest. Again, some of the things in the book are around sort of climate change and its effect on rural communities in Africa, which we don't hear enough about. So I wanted to highlight that. So they're stuck in this place called the circular forest, which is basically a desiccated part of the earth. the trees, all the trees have been taken away and sold and not replanted. And so they're sitting there and they have short time. And they're thinking, instead of us crying and thinking about the judgment that is facing us, why don't we have a talk show? And so they have a sort of a talk show, and that Duniso transcribes that. And that way I'm able to tell the stories of 6 different girls in 6 different voices, essentially in a very short time. So I was able to do that. Same thing with the letters. We have to go back into the past, and the best way to do that is through letters. So I think it allowed me to sort of explore sort of the complexity and the richness of the characters' journeys by doing that. And so that the last 10% we then focus on what happens next. And I really enjoyed having to tell stories in that way. It was really great to do that.
Well, I thought it was clever and brilliant. And I found that I stayed with those parts more because I wanted to just, embrace, how clever that was, how important, what they were saying and how important that was. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right, back to Phyllis. So part of the fun of book groups, beyond reading the book, getting together, eating with people, maybe having some wine. So your book, food is very central to it. And, as we mentioned, the main character, Margot, she's a cook. There's a lot of mention of what she's making. You even have some recipes at the end of the book. So book clubs, if you do choose to use this book, you might want to take a look at that, bring some things from that. But is there a particular recipe that you really felt like just encapsulated the book?
Like she said, Margot, the main character, she's the first high school graduate in her family. And but there's few opportunities in her segregated Mississippi hometown. Her mother is a cook in a family's home and then also bakes on the side. So Margot goes north for better opportunities, but she ends up doing the same thing, being a cook and baking on the side. And one of her most requested recipes is her 7-Up pound cake. But so I would say that recipe encapsulates was the one I would say would be my favorite out of the story, because that's something that she learned from her mother. And then also, even though, she despised, her mother's, living and all of that, that is what she ended up doing. But then it also was the basis for her business career. And then on a personal note, I did some research. My research wasn't as strenuous as Coco's, but what I did was bake, because I'm not a cook and I'm not a baker. But I did, I hadn't baked anything from scratch since high school. And so I went, I made these cakes and all of that. And so one of the things personally is that, I could do this. And so I think one of the things that another reason it resonates with me is to tell you to, try new things, get outside your comfort zone and all of that. So I would say the 7-Up pound cake.
That one did sound good. And that was a key thing for Margot too in the book, right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Taffy,
Hello.
the last one. Hi.
Hi.
So much to learn.
But there is so much to read. All these books sound amazing.
They do. So without preamble, not only is there a cast of dozens, more than dozens, around the rich but dysfunctional Fletchers, Long Island is a character too. I know that sounds hackneyed, but it totally is. So you capture the politics, the class structure, history, real estate. It's fabulous. And it's funny. So did you do any research, or did you just make all of it up?
Thank you for asking. I did the same research that that my new friends Phyllis and Coco did on theirs, but slightly different. I did not grow up in this house. I'm obsessed with wealth because I never had any. But I grew up in Brooklyn, but my father lived on Long Island, and I had like a good journalistic distance from it to observe what an absurd place it is. But to be sort of near it, but not of it, which is I think a great spot for writing about anything, to be an outsider. And I feel that's a theme that all of us have spoken about today, is this sort of where we stand on the line peeking in. But I grew up all of these towns on Long Island where the question that seems to permeate is a question that, as a New York Times journalist, I also experience on the front lines of other people's reporting about the economy, which is the question is, are we very, very rich or are we very, very poor? It's one or the other, and I can't quite tell which it is. And as the disappearance of the middle class in late stage capitalism comes in, it has been a question that I think everybody, we're hard on the next generation coming up, but I kind of can't blame them. They're a little bit confused as to what happened to the American dream. And I will tell you again, as a reporter, that Long Island is the front line for where it all went down. So that was my reporting. My father still lives there. My father is concerned about the book coming out. But you know, there you go.
I wanted to ask that of everybody. I was like, how many of your family members are going, you better not write this? Or my
family considers also that that my stories are the only inheritance I'm getting, so I can use them as well as I want to. It doesn't make it easy on them, but I think that everyone here knows that that the worst thing that could happen to you is a writer born into your family. I apologize for it all the time, and I have other good qualities, I think.
You have many. You all do. We have to leave it at that. I could talk to you all for hours, every one of you, and I really appreciate your participation, your books, everything like that. Now I have to say the closing comments, and which is also, again, thanks to you, authors, thanks to everybody watching this and joining us. And next we have 2 concurrent panels. You're going to have to make choices here. Literary reads and graphic novels changing the world one pixel at a time. Happy reading, everyone, and thank you again.
And thank you to the librarians.
Cheers.